The first time my daughter needed a home, I handed her the keys to mine. The last time I needed one, she was sitting in a title office at 9 in the morning, pen already uncapped, ready to sell the house I raised her in with me still alive, still breathing, still holding the one thing she never once thought to check. She'd arranged all of it: a buyer, an agent in a gray blazer, a folder of papers with little yellow flags where the signatures went. The one thing she never did was ask whose name the deed actually answered to. And what happened at that table wasn't even the worst thing I learned that month, so stay with me a while. Growing older never made me a burden. It only showed me who had already decided I was one. Let me tell you how I ended up at that table and who drove 2 counties in the dark when not a single one of my own children would pick up the phone. Welcome to Where Grace Remains, where quiet women tell the stories the world stopped listening to. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I read every single one. And if you've ever loved someone who simply stopped showing up for you, stay with me. You're going to want to hear how this one ends. So let me take you back to the beginning. My name is Frances Doyle. Everyone who mattered called me Frankie. I'm 76 years old, and for 38 of those years, I carried the mail up and down the back roads of Verona, Georgia, a town small enough that the post office and the diner shared a wall, and you could hear the coffee machine through it if the morning was quiet. A mail route teaches you to read a house. Not the paint, not the porch. The mailbox. You learn which house is waiting for a letter and which one has given up on the mailman. You learn that the box crammed with catalogs belongs to someone lonely, and the box that's always empty belongs to someone who moved their heart out a long time before they moved their furniture. 38 years of that, in the heat and the ice and the dog days when the tar went soft, and I never once needed anyone to carry a bag for me. I want you to hold on to that, because it matters later. I married Walt Doyle in 1971. He fixed diesel engines and told terrible jokes and loved me in the plain, dependable way that never announces itself and never once fails. We bought the house on Chalmers Road for $11,000 and a handshake, and we raised 2 children in it. Grant came first. Then Colleen, 4 years behind him, born in a January ice storm with a temper to match. I would have laid down in traffic for those two. I nearly did, more than once. When Grant totaled his first truck at 19, I paid it off with the overtime pay I'd been saving for a new roof, and I put a bucket under the leak for 2 more winters and never told him. When Colleen decided at 26 that she was going to dental school and her marriage was going to end in the same year, I drove 300 miles with a casserole and a checkbook, and I stayed a month. Love in my house was never a thing you said. It was a thing you did quietly, daily, without ever once keeping score. Walt died in the spring of 2016. Heart, in his sleep, no warning, which the doctor said was a mercy and I have never once agreed with. After that, the house got very large and very quiet. And here is where I did the one thing that saved my life, though I didn't know it then. I had a friend named Doreen from the Root, sweetest woman God ever made. And when she passed, her 2 boys tore each other apart over her little brick house on Register Street, sued each other, stopped speaking, sold the house to strangers for less than it was worth, just so the other one couldn't have it. I stood at Doreen's graveside and watched those grown men not look at each other, and something in me went cold and certain. So, I went to see Harlan Pruitt. Harlan was Walt's oldest friend, a retired lawyer who fished more than he ever practiced and had never told a lie in his life that I knew of. I sat in his kitchen and I said, "Harlan, I don't want my children fighting over my bones, and I don't want anyone deciding for me while I can still decide for myself." He helped me put the house on Chalmers Road and Walt's savings and a patch of timberland Walt bought in 1980 that everyone said was worthless into a trust, a real one, the kind you can't undo on a whim. I kept the right to live there the rest of my days. Harlan agreed to be the trustee, the one who actually holds the reins. And we told no one. Not because I was scheming, because it was mine to know, and no one had earned the asking. I want to be honest with you. I didn't do it because I saw this coming. I did it because I'd learned to read a house, and I'd started to notice things about my own children's boxes. The way Grant only called when the call had a purpose attached to it. The way Colleen's voice went flat and busy the second a conversation turned toward me. Little empty mailboxes. I didn't have a name for what I was seeing yet. I just knew to protect the house. The trouble came the way most trouble does. Quietly, dressed as concern. It was a Tuesday morning, October, and I put the kettle on and then I went out to deal with the fig tree before the frost, and I forgot the kettle entirely. By the time I smelled it, the bottom had scorched black and the smoke alarm was going, and my neighbor Ruth Ann had already called it in because she saw the haze in the window. No fire, no harm. A ruined kettle and an open window and a woman of 76 who'd made the same mistake any tired person makes. But my children had been waiting for a kettle. They just hadn't known it would be a kettle. Grant drove over that same night, and Colleen came the next morning, and for the first time in almost 2 years, they were both in my kitchen at once, which should have told me something right there. They sat me down at the table like I was the one who'd done something wrong. Grant did the talking. He always does the talking. "Mom," he said, "we've been worried." And this, he tapped the burnt kettle, which he'd set in the middle of the table like Exhibit A. "This is exactly what we've been worried about." I said it was a kettle. I said I'd been forgetting kettles since 1974. Colleen wouldn't look at me. She looked at her phone and at the ceiling and at Grant, and she said in that flat, busy voice, "We think it's time you were somewhere safe, somewhere with people. We've already looked at a place." Already. That was the word that landed. Not we'd like to talk about. Already looked. Already decided. The two of them had sat somewhere I wasn't and settled the rest of my life between them, and then driven out to inform me of the verdict with a burnt kettle for evidence. Now I want to tell you I stood up and set them straight. I didn't. I've thought a long time about why. I think it's because when you're young, betrayal makes you scream, and when you're older, it makes you quiet. I looked at my son, 48 years old, wearing the watch I helped him buy, and I looked at my daughter, who I sat up with through every fever of her childhood, and I understood in one cold breath that they were not asking me anything. They were managing me. Like a leak. Like a thing you put a bucket under. So I said, "All right, let me see the place." The place was called Maple Ridge. Assisted living, they called it, though I never once saw anyone assisted with anything but their bill. It smelled like lemon cleaner poured over something the lemon cleaner was meant to hide. My room had one window that looked out on the loading dock, and a shower with a folding seat, and a little laminated card on the dresser that told me when the dining room opened and closed, as if I could no longer be trusted with the concept of lunch. They moved me in on a Thursday, 19 days after the kettle. I know it was 19 because I counted every one of them, the way you count anything you can't quite believe is happening to you. And on the day they moved me, both of my children walked me to that little room and set my 2 suitcases on the bed. And Grant kissed my forehead and said something about how much better this was going to be, and then they left. Together. I stood at that one window and I watched my son's Tahoe and my daughter's white Lexus pull out of the lot, one behind the other, and I waited for one of them to slow down or look back or turn around. Neither did. The tail lights got small and then they were gone, and I was standing in a room that smelled like lemon and shame. You can be abandoned in a house full of people. I found that out at Maple Ridge inside of a week. I let myself cry for exactly as long as it took the sky to go dark. Then I stopped, because crying is a thing you do about the past, and I have never been able to stay in the past for long. There was a present to attend to. Here is what I did not do. I did not call them the next morning to beg. I did not tell them what I knew about the house, about Harlan, about the trust. I did not throw the papers on the table and blow the whole thing up. Not yet. I'd carried the mail through 38 winters. I knew how to wait for a thing to arrive on its own schedule. I wanted to see. I wanted to know exactly how far my own children would walk before something in them turned around. So I kept quiet. And I watched, and I let the days deliver their news. The news came fast. The first envelope, so to speak, arrived on the computer in the Maple Ridge Common Room. There was a young woman there named Desiree Okafor, 31 years old, an aide who worked doubles because she was putting her little brother through school, and who was the first person in that building to look at me like I was a person and not a room number. Des showed me how to use the computer, and on a slow Tuesday afternoon, with nothing better to do, I typed my own address into a real estate site. There it was, my house, my porch, where Walt built the swing, my kitchen still with the yellow curtains I sewed, photographed, staged, and listed for $412,000 and some odd cents, with a little red banner across the corner that said New Listing. My daughter's name was on it as the contact. She'd taken the pictures on a day I wasn't there. Someone had come into the home where I brought both of my babies back from the hospital and moved my things where they photographed better and put a price tag on it and never told me. I sat very still in front of that screen. Des put her hand on my shoulder and didn't say anything, which was exactly the right thing to say. On a mail route, you learn a house by its mailbox. And I'll tell you, my daughter had emptied mine out completely, and I hadn't even heard the truck. Now, here's where most people expect the tears again. But something else was rising in me by then, something quieter and stronger, and it had a shape, because I knew what my daughter didn't. You cannot sell a house that isn't yours to sell. And that house, for a long time now, had answered to a different name than she thought. I still didn't say a word. I wanted to understand the whole of it first. The second thing arrived through a doorway. Maple Ridge has thin walls, and Colleen came one afternoon to have me sign what she called a few forms of power of attorney, she said, just so we can handle the boring paperwork for you, Mom. I signed it. I read every line first, which she didn't expect, and I signed it because a power of attorney lets a person handle your affairs, but it does not let them reach into a trust and take what a trustee holds. She didn't know that. She thought that signature was the last lock on the door. She stepped into the hall to take a call, thinking I couldn't hear, and I heard her say to her brother, "It's done. Once the sale closes, we split it after the buyout on the place here, and she never has to know the numbers." 23 years I paid for that woman's every want, and there she stood in a hallway that smelled of lemon, arranging the numbers so I'd never have to be troubled by them. If you've ever been treated like a burden by the very people you once carried, do something for me. Say so in the comments. Just the age you were and where you were standing when you knew. I read every one of them, and I promise you, you are not the only one who has stood in that particular hallway. I could have ended it that night. One phone call to Harlan and the listing would have vanished. But I want you to understand something about that place, because a viewer once told me a story like this would have meant more if I'd let you see the others. And she was right. Maple Ridge was full of people whose mailboxes had gone empty. There was Walter Boyd, a different Walt, which I took as a small kindness from God 81, who wore a suit every Sunday and sat by the front door from 1 o'clock on because his son had promised once, years ago, to come on Sundays. He hadn't come in over a year, but Walter put the suit on anyway, and I understood that suit better than I understood most things. There was Rosa, who spoke to a photograph of her daughter every night and told the photograph about her day and never once said an unkind word about the daughter who put her there. There was a man named Cyrus who'd been a music teacher for 50 years and could still play anything, though the piano in the common room was a half step flat and no one had ever bothered to have it tuned. These were not burdens, these were libraries, and their own families had stopped checking out the books. Des told me the truth of the place in pieces, on her breaks. How short-staffed they ran, how the good aides quit because the pay was a joke and the hours were cruel. How the families who visited did it like a chore, 20 minutes with one eye on the parking lot, and how the ones who didn't visit at all told themselves the check they wrote was the same thing as love. And Des, this is the part I need you to hear. Des showed up. One night, I called her off the schedule, on her own day off, because I'd had a bad turn, and my voice came out wrong on the phone, and she drove through a hard rain to sit with me until it passed. My son lived 20 minutes away. That same night, at 11:47, he'd sent a text that said, "Thinking of you, Mom," with a little heart, and then he'd gone to sleep. Some people send the heart. Some people drive through the rain. It took me 76 years and one bad night to finally learn which one of those is family. Family isn't who you're born to. I was starting to understand that one wet night at a time. So, I made a decision, sitting in that lemon-smelling room. I was not going to simply stop the sale in the dark and slink back to Chalmers Road and pretend none of it happened. That would let them keep the story they'd told themselves, that they'd done a hard, loving thing for a mother who couldn't manage. No, I was going to let this go exactly where they were driving it, all the way to the table, in front of witnesses. And I was going to be there when the wheels came off. The closing was set for 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning at a title office on the square, 2 doors down from the diner where I used to hear the coffee machine through the wall. I asked Harlan to be there. I asked Des to drive me, and I did not tell my children I was coming. But before I take you into that room, I owe you a harder part, because a woman who only tells you the flattering pieces isn't telling you the truth. The night before, Colleen came to see me. She didn't know what was going to happen the next morning. She thought she'd already won. And she sat on the edge of that narrow bed, and for the first time in 2 years, she actually looked at me, and something in her face was cracked open. She said, "Mom, are you all right in here?" Really? And I could have said something kind. Instead, I asked her a question I already knew the answer to. I asked her when she'd last come to see me because she wanted to, and not because there was a form to sign, and she couldn't answer. She started to cry, real crying, the kind she did at 6 years old, and she said she didn't know how she'd gotten like this, that she was drowning in her own life, and I'd become one more thing she couldn't keep afloat, and she was so sorry, and could she please just come home? And there it is, the hardest fork in the whole road. Because part of me, the mother part, the part that carried her out of an ice storm in 1968, wanted to open my arms right there and undo all of it. And another part, a part I'd earned, sat very still and remembered a house listed at $412,000 and a hallway phone call about numbers I was never meant to see. I'm going to be fair to Colleen, because fair still costs something, and I've decided to keep paying it. She was not cruel the way the villains in stories are cruel. She was frightened and tired, and she had talked herself into believing that frightened, tired people are allowed to do quiet, terrible things to the people who love them most. I understand that woman. I do not excuse her. I have lived long enough to learn the difference, and the difference is the whole thing. Some of you already know exactly what you would have done in that room. Some of you would have shut the door on her that night for good, and some of you would have taken her home before her tears were even dry. So, be honest with me, because I've thought about it every day since. Would you have let her back in? Tell me. I'm reading. What I said to her that night was, "We'll talk tomorrow," which was true. I just didn't tell her where. At 9 o'clock the next morning, I walked into that title office on the square with Dez on one side of me and Harlan on the other. And I want you to know I didn't do it to be dramatic. I did it because some things need daylight and a witness. My children were already at the table. Grant had his checkbook out. Colleen had her yellow flagged folder. There was the buyer and the agent in the gray blazer and a title clerk with a stack of documents, and the whole warm hum of a deal about to close. Then they saw me in the doorway, and the room went quiet the way a room does when the person everyone was talking about walks in. "Mom," Grant said, half standing. "What are you? You didn't need to come all the way down here." I said good morning. I took a seat. I did not raise my voice. I have never once needed to. I didn't slam the trust papers down on that table. I didn't call my children out in front of strangers. I didn't say a single one of the 100 cutting things I'd had 19 days and then some to rehearse. I just looked at the title clerk, a nice young man named Peter, and I asked him kindly if he'd finished the title search. Because I've learned that the cleanest way to end a thing is to let the truth walk in on its own 2 feet. Peter got an odd look. He said, "Actually, ma'am, there's an issue with the vesting." He said the property on Chalmers Road wasn't held by the individual on the sale contract at all. It was held in an irrevocable trust. And the only person with the authority to sell it, he said, was the trustee. And the trustee, he looked at his paper, then he looked up, was a Mr. Harlan Pruitt, who raised one hand from the end of the table, the way you'd flag down a mail truck, and said, in his slow way, "That'd be me. And I haven't authorized any sale, never have. I have carried a lot of things in my life. Mail through blizzards, 2 children through fevers, a husband to his grave. But I will tell you, watching my daughter understand, watching it move across her face in real time, the folder going slack in her hands was the heaviest and the strangest thing I've ever held. There was no sale. There never could have been. They'd spent all summer trying to sell a house they had stopped living in years ago, and here is the thing they never once understood. You don't own a place by holding the deed. You own it by showing up. By that arithmetic, that house had been mine alone for a long, long time. Grant said my name, once, like a question. Colleen didn't say anything at all. She just looked at me, and then she looked at Harlan, and then at Dez, this young woman she'd never met, standing there because she'd chosen to, and I watched her do the math that mattered far more than any listing price. The math of who was in the room. Her mother had walked in flanked by the people who'd stayed, and every one of them was someone she wasn't born to. I did not gloat. I want you to know that, because I know some of you wanted me to, and I understand the wanting. But there is nothing to win at a table like that. There's only what you refuse to become. Grace isn't weakness. It's the strength that refuses to turn into cruelty, even when cruelty is sitting right there, cheap and available and already paid for. I stood up. I thanked Peter for his trouble, and I said the only thing I'd come to say. I told them the house was not for sale and never had been, and that I was going home to it that afternoon. I told them the trust would go, in the end, to the people and the places that had actually shown up in my life, and there was a young woman standing beside me, and a building full of forgotten people down the road, who between them had more claim on my gratitude than a listing agent ever would. I did not say they'd get nothing. I'm not made that way. I said the door of my house would be open to them for as long as I drew breath. But, I said, you will knock. And you will come because you want to sit with your mother, and not because there is a paper to sign. And if you never come at all, well, I have finally learned that I cannot force love out of a mailbox that was empty to begin with. I can only stop mistaking the empty box for a full one. Then I went home to Chalmers Road, and I opened the yellow curtains, and I put a new kettle on, and I watched it the whole time. I wish I could tell you it all mended clean. It didn't, and I won't lie to you to make a prettier ending. Grant took the longest. pride is a slow illness in the men in my family. But Colleen started coming on Sunday afternoons knocking. Every time, even now, even when the door's already open, she started leaving her phone in the car. It took months before we could sit in the same room without the whole title office sitting there with us, and there are days it still pulls up a chair. Real things heal at their own speed, and anyone who promises you otherwise is selling something. Des comes for supper on Wednesdays. I helped her brother with his tuition, the trust, and me, we agreed on that one gladly. Cyrus's piano finally got tuned. I paid a man from 2 towns over to come do it, and now half of Maple Ridge gathers in that common room on Thursdays to hear an 80-year-old play the songs their own children forgot to ask about. Walter Boyd still wears his suit on Sundays, but now, some Sundays, there's someone in the chair beside him. It isn't always his son. It's often me. A person can be family to a stranger on a Sunday. I've come to think that's most of what family ever was. I didn't win anything at that table. There was nothing to win. But for the first time in a long time, I stopped feeling invisible and I stopped confusing the people who managed me with the people who loved me. Those were never the same, and it only took me most of a lifetime to tell them apart. Because family isn't who you're born to. Family is who stays. They always knew the shape of my name on a birthday card. What they never once learned was the shape of my no. I know now which of those a mother has to keep for herself. If this story found a quiet place in your heart, the kindest thing you can do is subscribe and stay a while. There's another story already waiting for you. And tell me honestly, because I've wondered it every day since that morning. Would you have let her back in? Or would you have closed the door for good? There's no wrong answer. There's only your own true one, and I'd like to read it. Until the next time, take care of yourself. You still matter. You always did.